Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Abundance. I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner and research director here at California YIMBY. In this episode, I chat with Sarah Anzia. She's an associate professor of public policy and political science at the University of California at Berkeley. In this episode, we discuss how local politics differ from federal politics, the unusual power of firefighters unions, and of course, what all of this means for housing policy. Anzia is the author of Local Interests, Politics, Policy, and Interest Groups in U.S. City Governments. You should go buy a copy today. There'll be a link in the description. In this episode, we are once again joined by California YIMBY Policy Director Ned Resnikoff. Before you go, a couple quick requests here. If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button. It helps us out. And leave a review, especially telling us who you'd like to see on the show in the future. All of this helps us out. And with that, on to the show.
All right. Well, I'm joined today by, as always, the main host of the Abundance podcast, my colleague, research director Nolan Gray, and a professor of political science at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, and also my former grad school professor, Sarah Anzia.
It's really nice to see both of you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're here to talk about your recent book, Local Interests, but also about your work more generally on local politics, which I know has been sort of an ongoing preoccupation for years. And I think maybe I'll just start with a general question, which is, it seems like political scientists don't talk about local politics very much. And I'm wondering why that is, and why you decided to be an exception to that rule.
Thanks for asking that. I think that was true for a long time, and it's starting to change in that for the last 10 years or so, more political scientists have become interested and spent more time thinking about local politics, meaning cities, municipal governments, counties, and special districts and school districts in the US. And I think for a long time, national government, and this is still true to some extent, the federal government and even the states just seemed more interesting, right? And when it comes to the federal government, there's one of them. It's powerful. It can do almost anything, right? And name a policy area. It can extend its reach into that policy area. And it makes it easier to study when there's one of them rather than almost 90,000 of them. When it suddenly, any attempt to make a general statement about local government, it's hard to do that without some nuance and some conditionality. So I think that's part of it. But in addition, I think up until very recently, there was this prevailing sense that what local governments do or is just less interesting. It's boring. It's the kind of, is one term that's used is custodial policymaking. They do the things that keep life going, sidewalks, keeping things clean, picking up the garbage, and that just doesn't seem nearly as exciting when you put it that way as the Affordable Care Act. So I think that's another big reason for a long time, political scientists and many other policy practitioner folks, others interested in government in the US, weren't as focused on local government. And I think one of the reasons that started to change is that some of the problems that are national in scope that have come to the fore in the last 10 years happen to be mostly the responsibility of local and to some extent state government. And so suddenly there's a big problem. Test scores have gone way down. The housing crisis is just getting worse and worse. Suddenly we're getting video footage of horrific treatment of Black Americans by some police officers. And it's in people's faces that there are these problems. It's not just one place. It seems to be everywhere, or in many places, and suddenly people say, well, what's happening? What's going on? Who's doing this? And it was funny because at one point, Barack Obama gave a speech where he said, if you want to know about policing, you really want to focus on local governments. And so I think that has shifted the spotlight to local governments and has increased interest in what's actually happening there. And I don't want to be unfair or uncharitable, because there are, of course, really great scholars who have been spending a lot of time thinking about local politics for years. I would never claim I'm the first to care about this. There have been a number of really good people who have spent their careers thinking about local government, but they too, I believe, have seen their work their work being read more, right? There's been become greater interest in there's come to be greater interest in what they're doing. And so I think that's a positive development, even though it's happened because the problems have become more salient, more visible, and more prevalent, and have worsened.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to, I think, some of your intellectual influences or forebears here. But I think first I want to talk a little bit about what is novel and interesting about your approach, because when I think of the existing political science literature on local politics, it's very qualitative. A lot of it is very case study driven. But you have a pretty interesting comparative quantitative approach to looking at these issues. And I was wondering if you could walk us through a little bit what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah, I think that for this is related to the first question, and that for a long time, the best known studies of local governments were of big cities, usually a single city like Atlanta or Chicago, and they're excellent, or New York. But it creates the impression, which is sometimes true, sometimes not, that the problems of cities or local governments are specific to a place. There may be some general claims about local government in general, but when you're reading about the city of Atlanta, it's hard to know whether the themes, the pattern, there's any generalizability to what you're reading about. And so I think that that's one reason why, for a long time, the study of local politics just didn't gel well with the rest of the stuff that was happening in political science, in the American politics subfield. And I think that that started to change as people who were more quantitatively inclined and started thinking about local politics more. But then there were, even when people started using quantitative analysis and quantitative methods to try to understand what's going on in local politics, there was a tendency to focus on certain things. And again, this is not to say focusing on those things is wrong, but for example, the role of race, right? The role of race and ethnicity, and more recently, the role of partisanship and ideology. So one of the big changes we've seen in the study of local politics and political science in the last 10 years is that there have been a number of studies trying to figure out whether the partisanship and ideology we see driving decision-making or non-decision-making in national politics and increasingly state politics also explains differences in how local governments operate. And there's been some back and forth, but this has been a huge emphasis of local politics research so far. So the good thing about it is that this is a real question we would want to know the answer to, but also it takes this different approach of maybe what Chicago is doing is not totally different from what all these other places are doing. Maybe there are actually patterns to how local governments operate. Maybe there are things about them that are not idiosyncratic, where you don't have to be an expert in Palo Alto, California to be able to say anything about Palo Alto, California. You can find systematic variation. You can find relationships that would carry over to a large number of local governments. And so I think that's a really important shift, and one that I have embraced, even though I tend to emphasize different things. I'm very much, in my recent book and in other work, focused on ways in which local governments and what's happening there are very similar to one another.
Yeah, and your book is called Local Interests. So it's focused on interest groups in local politics, which look very different in a number of ways from the way I think people conceptualize of interest groups operating on the federal level, lobbying Congress members. And so could you talk a little bit about what local interest groups look like, how they're distinct from national interest groups, and Also, maybe what some of the major players on the local level tend to be?
Yeah, I think this is also, interestingly, a reason why it's taken, one of the many reasons it's taken a long time to get to this point where we're asking who are the interest groups in local politics, because it's really common for all of us, I think, to take what we know about some context and see if it fits in some other context. And I think that's been an approach that we know a lot, actually, about certain things about the interest group environment in Washington, D.C. You have a lot of business, big corporations. You don't, union activity in Washington, D.C. In terms of the number of interest groups, it's quite low. So we know a lot about the Washington, D.C. interest group environment, and also increasingly the state interest group environment. And so there is a tendency to think that, well, it seems like it's all about the resources of the group. And that's probably going to hold at the local level. And actually, I think that it helps to think about local government as possibly being quite different. And it's different because the issues that they're taking on, the issues that local governments have responsibility for, are oftentimes quite different from the issues that are the bread and butter of federal or state government. And it really is the issues, the policy areas that these governments are responsible for, that sort of shapes the interest group activity that emerges in large part. So to answer your question directly, by doing various surveys of city elected officials and candidates for city offices across the US, what I found is that you tend to see a few major players, interest group players, in large numbers being most active in city politics. And they are local chambers of commerce, real estate developers, neighborhood associations, police unions, and firefighters unions. We could spend a lot of time unpacking all of that and why it is, but the short explanation that I come to in the book is that it's because those groups have a large, direct, regular, and economic material interest in the core decisions that many city governments are making. In fact, almost all city governments, municipal governments, are making.
It won't surprise you to learn that some of the most interesting stuff to come out of that work, to me at least, was the housing politics. I believe, top line, your findings were stronger chambers, more active chambers are associated with faster permitting timelines. I thought that was such a great, variable to test for that, because I mean, you see variation in permitting timelines that aren't really clearly explained by anything else. But that was a really interesting input. Something that also surprised me too is that the inverse, more NIMBY outcomes, so to speak, are largely driven by percent homeowner, and not so much. I think you said not so much neighborhood associations or environmental groups, which was surprising. I mean, it suggests that this isn't like an interest group in the sense of these people are organizing into coherent entities, but they're this kind of decentralized, disorganized interest group. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. It has to do with what we can say is common about these groups and these interests across the many places I look at. So I want to be clear. I am not saying that environmental groups never matter or never make a difference to local development or housing decisions. That just simply would not be true. And same thing for neighborhood associations. We know if you just go, as I'm sure you see, place to place, you see homeowners associations, neighborhood associations being quite active. And I think the reason the relationships I find looking at those housing and development outcomes in the book, the reason I find some ambiguity about the statistical relationships in those cases is because it's not always clear whether a neighborhood association or an environmental group is the same across all of these places in the sense of their interest in that thing we care about. And this is something I have at one, I had to finish the book, and a book can't do everything, or else no one will read an 800-page book about, statistical analysis of local interest groups. But one of the
our listeners might.
One of the things that's good to know, because I have thoughts about continuing this inquiry. In particular, environmental groups are really interesting to me. I'm specifically interested in how much heterogeneity or homogeneity there is in the positions or preferences of different environmental groups across places. You could imagine environmental groups taking a variety of different and often conflicting positions on local policy matters related to housing or development. And I think that's an empirical question. I'm sure the two of you have something to say about that and what that looks like in California. I find it to be fascinating because it's not clear from the outset which position these groups might take on some of these matters we look at. So I think my best guess is that's the reason for what appears to be a weaker relationship between the activity of environmental groups and the speed of the review process or for housing development or the number of units that are permitted. Whereas in contrast, and the same thing, by the way, goes for neighborhood associations. What is a neighborhood association? It could take on a variety of different meanings with a variety of different goals from place to place, and even within a place over time. It's a little bit different for a chamber of commerce. And now, yes, there is surely some variation in what they do and how they go about it, but they're there to promote the interests of business. And so I think it's a little bit simpler with that. And with homeowners are a little bit of a different story. And because it's not, I don't think we can think of homeowners as an organized group in isolation. It's more, I think, an instance where it may not be the same homeowners who react for every different project. It could be a different set. It's just you have some consistency. If you want to put a large multifamily housing unit over there, guess what? If there were homeowners nearby, somebody's going to be upset. It's a different, and that's why I talk about in the book how actually housing and land use more generally it's very important. It's a little bit different in the political dynamics compared to some of the other local or municipal issues I look at in the book, because you have this dynamic. If you put up a large apartment complex in a neighborhood of single family homes, well, you can see that. You can see the building going up. It's noisy. It's affecting the traffic. It's dusty. And also, it isn't hard to trace that back to somebody's decision on the city council or what have you, or on the planning commission, and say, I don't like this and I'm going to punish you. And so that is different from a lot of the other trade-offs or conflicts that you can imagine coming up in city politics, that visibility, that directness, and that someone is being very directly and economically impacted in the sense that they're thinking about their home values and also their quality of life, as they would call it.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about your work with regard to housing in particular, and maybe a little bit counterintuitive, is you mentioned real estate developers earlier, and I was a little bit struck by, I mean, there's still a significant interest in local politics, but less so than you might think, at least based on your data. And I was wondering if you could walk us through why that might be the case, because obviously, on the homeowner side of things, when they see development going up, the I think visceral reaction is always, oh, it's these developers that have a lock on City Hall and can run roughshod over everyone. But even when stuff gets built, it's not really necessarily due to the political influence of developers as a block. It seems like there's often something else going on.
Yeah, well, I think some of this is historical in nature, and that there was a time period in which there was this fear rooted in real events of developers having too much power. And if you go back 40 years, that's the flavor or the theme of many things that were written. And also one of the reasons that participation and public meetings were, of course, why those institutional changes spread. But developers, in certain important ways, are not the same as the homeowners who are living next to the proposed development, or even chambers of commerce, in that a developer is not locked into a most of the time, I wouldn't think we'd say a developer is locked into working with a particular community, right? A developer, it's a business. And you could imagine a developer shopping around. Okay, if I imagine this community is really hostile to the idea of what I would like to build, and I'm going to encounter a lot of opposition and have to do all these expensive reports, and it's never going to go through, and 10 years of my life will go by. Maybe I just go somewhere else. And a developer, and I'm not saying that option is universal. Of course, if, big cities, maybe you have to find business in that city, but there is that ability to exit to some extent or shop around. Now, a homeowner, of course, this is William Fischel's big argument, a homeowner is living there and has less ability to move, in the sense that the home for many people is their biggest asset, and it's very difficult to move. And so in a greater sense, that individual is a little more locked in, perhaps. And so what do you do? Well, William Fischel says they participate in local politics because of that. If they can't easily move, they participate and they try to block things that are going to affect their their assets value. Also, chambers of commerce is sort of interesting. I think this is easier to see with public sector unions, but the same holds with chambers of commerce. A local chamber of commerce, say El Cerrito, California, it's there to think about business in El Cerrito. It's not going to pick up and move to Dana Point. It's simply not going to happen. It makes no sense. The whole point of the organization is to represent businesses and the interests of business in El Cerrito. Just like a police union it's there to represent police officers in a particular place. If they don't like what's happening in a given city, they can't just up and move to the south. They have fewer options and have to some extent, get invested in what's happening in local decision making. And that's less the case for developers. You might just see them not want to get into it. Does that answer your question, Ned?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this touches on something else that I was also interested in. And you referenced it earlier when you were talking about the I can't remember the exact phrasing you used, but the sort of direct permanent economic stake.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a public choice theory framework, I think, in the background here. And I'd like to maybe try out a theory on you, which is that obviously, as you probably recall from teaching poli-sci at UC Berkeley, people object a lot to the use of public choice frameworks in various scenarios. I think maybe it might be fair to say that the public choice framework has slightly less utility than maybe it used to on the federal level when things have become so much more ideologically charged, but that this framework does seem to capture something deeper at the local level, where it does seem to actually be about these very sort of direct, clear economical interests. Which is why you have homeowners in like Berkeley behaving the same way as homeowners in much more conservative cities.
Actually, it's interesting you say this, because in a draft of the book that was too long, I took it in a direction similar to what you're suggesting, and then through some input of others and thinking about it, I took most of it out. And the idea is related to Jeffrey Berry's post-materialism arguments about national politics, that during the 70s, the 80s, we saw a shift, or 60s, 70s, 80s, we saw a shift away from what was thought of as a sub-government iron triangle. You have these large trade associations that have a lock on federal decision-making, government decision-making, and they just have cozy relationships with federal agencies, to one in which you have a lot of groups. There are a lot of consumer groups and environmental groups, and I'm not doing this justice. Jeff Berry has a couple of books on this topic, but he talks about this shift to post-materialism and why it happened, and it has to do with the Ford Foundation and the like. So in short, one of the things I was thinking about suggesting in the book, and I think there is something to this, is that may not have happened to the same extent in local government. That local government, more so than national government, is still a lot about people getting stuff for themselves and their groups and their interests in it. And we could talk about why that is. You know, you could walk through all the things that happened at the national level that may not have happened at the local level. But I think there's something to that. So in short, I think what you're suggesting, there's something to that.
Well, just to riff on this for a little bit, you know, something that's always fascinated me is that when we survey, I mean, you know, there's surveys suggesting that there seems to be a trend that when you're trying to see what makes people take a more pro-housing posture, more favorable to housing near them, I've been consistently impressed by how uncompelling folks seem to find more ideological arguments, maybe about climate change or more arguments perceived as more partisan, climate change, racial equity, but then like, you know, these more like sanguine arguments of like, well, like you should be allowed to do what you like with your property, or like, don't you want your kid to be able to buy a home near you? Like these seem to perform pretty well, right? And I think that like is sort of, people are still, they're still approaching the issue from like a very self-interested perspective, which is like they probably wouldn't have adopted relative to like asking someone about like their views on abortion or their views on free trade. Probably are significantly less likely to be rooted in some sort of personal self-interest.
Yeah, I mean, trade is challenging, and I think it depends on where you are and you know, what occupation and all that. But and there's a certain irony here, which is that people pay a lot more attention to national politics than local politics, and that abstract is really exciting, right? People, I always joke about how people seem more excited about the fly on Mike Pence's head during the debate with Kamala Harris than what's happening on their local school board when the schools are closed. They have been in remote learning for a year and a half. And so it just seems more exciting. But it's interesting to put that next to what you're saying, Nolan, about the arguments that resonate with people when it comes to housing.
But the added irony is that like local governments, that's the level of government at which like we're actually begging people to like share their views. And they're like, no, yeah, I would rather watch CNN and get like gaslit into like having an opinion about the fly on Mike Pence, right? Like
yeah, I mean, this is again, I think we could talk for a long time about this. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I can't explain why there is this difference in interest. And part of it too is that for most people, local meetings, spending 5 hours at a city council meeting or a planning commission meeting or a school board meeting is on a weekly or biweekly basis just doesn't sound that fun. But that's where the important decisions are made. You add it all up. That's what's created some of these crises I talked about at the beginning.
Well, not to take us too far down this path, but I've got a bit of a theory about this, which is that it has to do with the sort of Theta Skocpol diminished democracy argument that you know, when you talk about the institutions you reference in the book, things like chambers of commerce, labor unions. You could also add churches and sort of just like local social clubs to those. Those have all been on the decline at the same time that national media and especially cable news television has really risen as a form of mass entertainment. And so I wonder if there's a little bit of a switcheroo that happened here where the institutions that actually connected people to local politics and sort of organized them around local politics died at the same time that all of a sudden there were all these different channels into the spectacle of national politics emerging.
Yeah, I think that's a contributor. And just to add a couple more. One is, of course, the growth in the scope of the federal government, right? So that's been a change happening around the same time. And there's the Eitan Hirsch argument about the difference between having a nice one-liner on Twitter versus actually taking the time and doing the hard work that you folks are doing to make change in a real way. So I think that really it's some combination of these things. But it's well, I'll stop there.
Yeah, we Nolan and I both know the seductive power of a one-liner on Twitter, though. We're not just in the trenches all day. We're also posting quite a bit.
Always be
Absolutely.
posting. Yeah. I want to pick up on a distinction you made that I thought is really interesting. The idea of like certain interest groups just being more mobile, right? And so they take the exit rather than the voice strategy, right? So the homeowners have to stick around, the chamber has to stick around. The developer is like, cool, I can just go build in the next jurisdiction. And a quick comment on that, it's interesting because we'll pass some of these laws that maybe have a shot clock provision, and a developer, if a jurisdiction fails to, adhere to that rule, of course, the developer could still sue for permits, or like they would have certain legal rights. But even in this context where we've created protections, like it's still rational for them to be like, no, yeah, I'll let the next developer fight that fight. Like I can just move, right? And so that makes it tough to like actually have protections that depend on enforcement. But my question here is, it seems like I think renters were in a similar situation, right? Where like renters are, as a sort of like weird disorganized interest, so to speak. I don't know how you would think of that. Their strategy, same thing. The rents are going up. Okay, maybe it would be in my long-term, there's some path where I could stick around and fight the fight and get more housing built here, but
yeah.
I'm just going to move and find a cheaper apartment somewhere else. But it seems like something's changed, right? And I mean, that's the basis of YIMBY politics, is YIMBY's a certain type of renter saying, no, I'm going to stick around and actually fight tooth and nail. And I'm wondering, like, why has that seemed to change? Would you frame that differently?
So I don't know. It's a really good question. It would seem important to note that when things get really bad, the dynamics change. And with housing in the Bay Area, I think we can say it's really bad. Was it bad 15 years ago? Yes. Is it worse now? Yes. And so I think that that's probably a factor, just like with healthcare costs. Were they bad and getting worse in the 90s? Yes. But by 2010, it was even worse. So I think that probably plays a role. And there's another really interesting question here about power too, which is the ability to leave. Because what the argument I make in the book is that leads them to potentially invest less in that place. You could also imagine the ability to leave. It leaves certain groups behind. The people who are left, in some ways, they're the ones who continue to have power, right? Because local officials still have to be responsive to the people who are there. So that is an interesting mobility dynamic to think through. Big implications potentially for, Detroit was the big example for a long time. Now everyone's talking about San Francisco. So mobility is an interesting thing in terms of the changes it makes for incentives for responsiveness at a local level as well. It's a big, big topic.
Talking about how much worse San Francisco has gotten, we're now progressing from the light, fun, theory-driven part of this conversation to the real fiery, hot button stuff. It does seem to me that as much as we've talked about how ideology pertains a little bit less at the local level, it's still the case that when you look at the cities that are really struggling the most with basic questions of governance, they do tend to be very blue cities in very blue states. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. And, if you compare them to a place like Houston or some of the Sunbelt cities, they certainly have their challenges, but you're not really looking at the staggering housing costs, homelessness crises, just kind of breakdowns in urban governance like you've seen in Los Angeles recently with all the indictments. And obviously there's a sort of like Fox News soundbite argument of this, which is just that it's like woke ideology is ruining America's great cities. But I wonder if there's a way to kind of get at what's actually going on that doesn't embrace that, but at the same time doesn't just, I think, as sometimes the impulses for those of us on the progressive side of things to just kind of look the other way and pretend it isn't there.
Yeah. I think that many people have that tendency. It's uncomfortable. And I think that one thing that goes on at the local level is that people have their interests, right? They have some awareness of what they would like to see happen. And it gets difficult when that seems to collide with their ideology or sort of abstract views. And I saw this kind of thing time and again, living in the East Bay during the prolonged school closures. I knew a lot of people who would call themselves very progressive, absolutely Democrats, but and they really wanted their kids to be able to go to school and had their kids in schools in some large urban districts where there was great pushback against reopening. And I really saw some of the internal tensions bubbling up in those moments. I think it's with housing, you see this too, right? Like I don't want people to, be homeless, without a home because housing prices have become so outrageous. Also, I like where I live and I like my, being able to park in front of the cheese shop and, so I think this is actually really difficult for people as individuals. And so there are a lot of things going on in what you said, Ned, and some of them people have been talking a lot about these processes lately, that in places like California, New York, or Illinois, for good reasons and good intentions, there are a lot of processes in place to ensure that people have voice, to ensure that there is that racial equity is being considered, to ensure access. And so I think, and all of those good things, and I'm not new in raising this, all those things add on top of one another and make it difficult to do things that would be good. It makes it hard to govern because you have to contend with all these different processes that create veto points, that create blockages. But I'm going to shift it a little bit more in the direction of groups, because it's related and it's more of what I've been thinking about for the last few years. One of the findings in chapters 3 and 4 of my recent book, Local Interests, is that cities in which residents lean Democratic or have liberal views on things, they actually tend to have more groups active in local politics. They have more interest group activity and more interest groups. Now, why is that? One possibility that I considered very early on is that maybe because these ratings of interest group activity were based on surveys, it's based on surveys. I thought maybe it's just that people in more Democratic or liberal places are more likely to say, yeah, we have a lot of group activity. That doesn't seem to be the reason. It looks like actually there are more groups and different kinds of groups in blue cities, large and small. And I think the pattern I uncovered is that for certain businesses, chambers of commerce, developers, their activity at the local level in local politics doesn't vary with the ideology or partisanship of a place. They're active in a large number of places regardless. It's the public sector unions, the building trades, environmental groups, neighborhood associations. These groups are more active in blue places. And so that's not to say this is good or bad, but I think if you put that up against or you combine that with these potential differences in processes and the process you have to go through in order to make things happen, it just creates more gridlock, more. And I think that, again, it's only when a crisis gets bad enough and we can sort of step back and look at the lay of the land and say, would anyone want this to be the policy? Like, would anyone want this outcome? No, we would want to do this. It's only then that we start to say, why can't we fix this? And then we're looking at the groups and the processes and the institutions and the veto points. I think all of those things are contributing to both how we got in this position and why it's so difficult to change it.
There's also a little bit of I think maybe a chicken egg thing going on here too, where it seems like those processes can create constituencies. Like, I think one of the reasons why it's so hard, for example, to meaningfully reform CEQA is that once you create the system of environmental review, all of a sudden you create a highly organized group of lawyers who have built their entire career around CEQA suits. And do you see something like that happening at the municipal level that might be helping to create all these different organizations?
Yes, I can speak to a couple at least. It would be interesting to know, for example, whether the prevalence of neighborhood associations changed with the growth or the spread of public meetings and requirements for public meetings and comment periods and the like. I don't know the answer to that, but it would be a great thing to look at. But definitely with public sector unions like police and firefighters, a major set of state policy changes that changed the incentive structure for public employees to form unions it was the state laws that determined that if making it a requirement that if employees of a particular group form a union, then that local government or state government must bargain in good faith on certain matters of the terms of employment, wages, salaries, and so on. And so those state laws absolutely led to growth in union membership for the occupations affected. So that's when you see in California, police officers, firefighters, teachers joining groups and joining unions to be able to engage in collective bargaining. And now it's something we take for granted. It's part of the institutional structure. It's one of those processes that is in place. If you want to change this provision regarding what happens after there's some use of force incident, right? Well, in most that would probably be bargained to be subject to bargaining. And so then you have the process you go through to change that. So that's one example of how institutions and policies have potential to give rise to or strengthen or weaken in some cases the interest groups that are involved and there to say something about these policy matters.
Well, that's a really, really interesting point. I think that state institutions can essentially shape the playing field that makes certain interest groups in a relatively stronger position. I mean, I think, what we're up to in California with, California YIMBY with housing laws is, occasionally there just have been like flat preemptions. Like you have to allow ADUs and residential areas, you have to allow mixed income multifamily on corridors. But a lot of the most effective laws have been just like, okay, you don't get to jerk around the developer like to X degree. And like, that's not a preemption, but that like slightly changes the extent to which that interest group can advocate for itself. Yes.
And that is, we could talk about this in a very general and neutral way. And people either like or dislike these things depending on how their particular positions or interests are affected. This is not to take issue with what you said, but for example, when Scott Walker in Wisconsin said, okay, bargaining, you can only bargain over wages to up till this point. Like people really didn't, a lot of people really didn't like that. It's the same kind of idea. You're not getting rid of bargaining. You're just saying, here is a limit to what can be done on wages. But it's a big deal, right? It's a big deal because it matters. It's a big deal because it changes, it decreases the flexibility for certain groups and it changes the balance of power.
Well, my extremely principled position on preemption is I support it when it affirms my policy preferences and I oppose it when it doesn't.
You're like most people.
Yeah.
The Scott Walker example is interesting though, because I remember I was a labor reporter when that was going on, and it was very clear at the time that part of what Walker was doing was targeting public sector unions as an institution because they were a cornerstone of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. And This is something that I think about a lot in the sort of YIMBY power politics context, where one thing that you don't really see more progressive organizations do a lot, or organizations that are maybe a little bit on the wonkier end of things, is kind of think about power in that way, where it's like we can create or reduce the power of constituencies that play a role in this. And so, regardless of the merits of the policy, there's also this element of how you're shaping the rules for the next round. It's something that, I don't know. I mean, the counterexample here, the reverse of the Scott Walker case is, I think, when I can't remember the name of the last Democratic governor of Virginia, but he had an opportunity to undo Virginia right to work and was incredibly reluctant to do so. And it just seemed so crazy to me. Again, regardless of I have my own views on this, but regardless of the merits of the policy, it's like, if you undo right to work, then you are increasing the power of labor, which is like a core Democratic constituency. And that's going to help you avoid what ended up being the outcome in the next election. And I don't know. It seems like something that's worth, from a YIMBY perspective, thinking about on the local level, both like building more housing, but also empowering the sort of voters and constituencies that are going to continue to lead to desirable policy outcomes.
Yeah, I think another way of putting it is that there can be variation across policy areas, and whether the effects of it are going to be felt mostly within that area or in that locality, or in the ones that are going to spread and have longer term. And I think that we could give a lot of examples of this, where maybe the reason some action was not taken was because if you look down the game tree, it's actually going to hurt some group that's helping you in Nevada. And I think that this is a real thing. And when it comes to housing, I think that the partisanship aspect of it is still, it's not the same as public sector unions. It's quite different. And yeah, there's some nuance there with public sector unions too, because you have police, you have firefighters, right there. There are Republican teachers, right? There's a lot going on there, but even more so probably with housing. And I think that you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that in terms of the organized groups that are spending a lot of money, right, and active with housing, it still feels a bit more fragmented. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a new sort of like interest group landscape has congealed in California over the last, decade or so. I mean, I not to seem a little bit, maybe this is my position as a YIMBY, right? Of course, I'm naturally going to say, well, there have been new, powerful, amazing groups that have come in and disrupted the landscape. Yeah, I mean, I do think the nature of the politics, I think it partly goes back to like the sort of very decentralized nature of the opposition and the very ad hoc nature of it. I mean, and something when you were talking about that too, it made me think of how the politics are so different when you're doing land use policy at the comprehensive or the general plan stage. It's actually I've always sort of felt that it's so much more healthy. We're talking about the broader picture of the community. And then but the standard dynamic is a project is being built on your block. This is what it's going to look like. And that sort of public process in that context is so much less productive, right? The interest groups can only really come and say no, and by that point the project's already pretty baked. But when we have this earlier stage where we can actually do some like deliberation and bring folks in, the political dynamics are a little bit healthier, I think. Yeah,
and I also think it goes back to, in some ways, when Walker came out with the budget repair bill, or Act 10. It was predictable. There were big groups that were negatively affected by that, and they showed up, right? Massive protests. With housing, it's a little different. And like I was saying earlier, it's a different set of people locally, depending on the project, and there are powerful interests at stake here. But it's not. My understanding is it's not always going to be the same people. It's the people who live nearby, depending on where your plotting to put the housing. So it's different in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the YIMBY approach to this issue is, okay, there's an implicit understanding of what you found, which is there's many jurisdictions where they're majority homeowner, and these groups are very opposed to new housing, and they're very effective at realizing those preferences. So we just have to shift this to a level of government, shift a lot of these decisions to a level of government where the dynamics are very different. I mean, I think it may be an answer to your last question a little bit more. The political landscape is very different at the state level, you know. So of course it's unions, it's housing groups, it's environmental groups. I think much more like the classic interest group sort of haggling that we would expect to see of, like, you know, these are large established long-term players who, you know, at least theoretically have like consistent interests. Yeah. But of course that's very much in flux. I mean, year to year, the coalitions behind bills can change pretty dramatically.
Yeah, as we have seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, it raises an interesting question, I think, about local jurisdictions too, because when you're talking about interest groups within a jurisdiction, I would imagine that the actual geography of the jurisdiction matters a lot there, right? The sort of interest groups that will be involved and their interests might vary a lot depending on whether you're talking about the actual core of a metropolitan area or one of the outlying suburbs or exurbs. And I raise this because I think that one of the reasons why we've shifted so much of the YIMBY activity to the state level is that a lot of times those geographical boundaries are drawn in a way that doesn't actually reflect the balance of costs and benefits to current land use policy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think that this is these jurisdictional boundaries. One issue it's raised for me is just the questions about how in political science we think about representation, right? So there is a well-established way of looking at whether policies seem to be responsive to the interests of the public. For example, you have public opinion on some issue, you have policies on that issue. You can see whether there's some mapping of public preferences on the issue to policy in that jurisdiction. And if you see a strong relationship, you say, good, well, this is good. Representation is happening, or it's strong. And I think that the housing example, the housing issue raises question, well, makes me skeptical that's all we care about, right? Yes, we care about that, but it's not the only thing we care about. We also care about whether we're getting good outcomes. And the reason I say this is that with housing, part of, if let's say, imagine we're taking public opinion poll, we're doing public opinion polls on housing in different jurisdictions in California. And you might find really strong relationships between support for multifamily or high density housing in a place and the level of high density housing in a place. And you might say, using that standard method, great, representation is happening. However, you're only looking at the people who actually live there, right? Not the people who can't. You're not thinking about the opinions of people who cannot live there because the housing is too expensive, right? And so it sort of breaks down or suggests the need for consideration of more and different ways of thinking about representational quality. I would call it governance, right? Once we're thinking about governance, we're not just thinking about, do the people who live there like what's happening there? We're thinking about, the people who would like to live there, and are their interests being represented? Things of that sort, sort of expanding out.
Yeah, I think that's the original sort of one of the OG YIMBY arguments, right? Everybody gets a say at the public hearing except for the future residents, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and people say, oh, but they could come. And it's just unrealistic. To think that someone's going to go participate in a public meeting for a place that they may someday, be able to move to. It's unrealistic once we're thinking about the cost of participating like we were earlier.
But even there, right, I think like the way that YIMBYs will often try to overcome this. And so, for example, when I was a planner in New York, we would often have applicants who had to have an affordable component on a project. We would say, for certain areas, make this senior affordable housing. And then you can go to that community board meeting and say, this is senior affordable housing for like 80 to 120% AMI. wink, wink, nod, nod. That's a lot of the people who are on the community board potentially in the next 5 to 10 years. And people start to think, oh, this is housing that I might live in. So I'm a little bit more like less resistant to it. And that gets back to this whole, like, I think what you were getting at is like the people's local policy views seem to be so much more driven by a self-interest, which is, fascinating. And like, that, or for example, framing some of these issues in terms of, well, we need to build more homes because don't you want your children to live near you, right? That connects so much better than more ideological or partisan arguments than we would think.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. It's interesting to think, though, about, to a certain extent, that's also been true of things that I think are now considered more ideological issues, but have like a past life as these more sort of direct quality of life issues. I'm thinking in particular of, I mean, the way we talk about the civil rights movement now is, and I'm not just, for our listeners, I'm not comparing YIMBYism to the civil rights movement at all. But I think it's interesting that if you actually look at how it was playing out at the local level, it wasn't the sort of anodyne, clean, ideological story that we tell now about it, but it really was about this question of I mean, for example, with busing, the way that parents, white suburban parents, reacted to busing was very much driven by a perception of their personal interests. It wasn't just like general, like it wasn't just sort of like a generalized immaterial prejudice. It was connected to how they perceived their material status within that community. And I guess maybe to turn that into a question, I mean, we talked about how YIMBYism has thus far kind of avoided the trap of becoming partisan. It's something where we've got Democratic supporters and Republican supporters on bills. There's bipartisan legislation in Congress, like actual bipartisan legislation in the U.S. Senate. But it does seem to me like when you're dealing with it's one thing when you're dealing with the low-hanging fruit when it comes to those things, and when you're dealing with the obvious, I guess, like the obvious fringe cases where things are so extremely egregious. But are we also kind of on an inevitable path toward becoming something that is a little bit more ideologically clear cut?
I don't think so. Because of some of the things we were talking about earlier. As far as I know, there isn't some massive national and scale organization primary interest is in some aspect of housing development that's giving 95% of their money to Democratic or Republican candidates. And because of the issue, I don't see, as of this point, I don't see that happening. And apologies for shifting again to local employees. It's just something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I think we could compare teachers and police on this issue. Look, people have been active on education reform for decades now. This is not new, and it's also not newly partisan. Right? It goes back to at least the 80s, and so and it's not obvious if you just think about the nature of the issue. It's not obvious that, oh, I'm a Democrat, I don't want charter schools. I mean, that's simplifying that particular issue. But we do see that a lot of education policy kind of has that partisan or ideological feel to it. Not every part of it, absolutely, but and not just the masking or COVID vaccines or book banning or any in any case, it's not just those kinds of issues. So, but what you do have is interest groups the NEA, the AFT, who give most of their contributions to Democrats, and they're big and they have a lot of members and they play a big role in many states, most states, and at the federal level. Okay, so that is different. And it relates to Scott Walker and what you were saying before. Police are a little bit different. And I think that everybody, oftentimes nowadays, people make claims, well, clearly their police are going to be pro-Republican because they're police officers. And also I say they're unions and they have an interest in local spending. And it's just it's mixed up, right? It's not clear which side they would land at. Both sides, probably, just like correctional officers. And so I think that's an example of public employees and unions where you don't see this natural splitting out. You look at campaign contributions of police unions, I believe it's oftentimes split at the state level between Republicans and Democrats. So I think there you do have a group, but they're not aligned with one party or the other. And I think when it comes to housing, as of this point, I don't see much potential for some big, massive group that's just on one side and giving to Republicans only or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And actually, thank you for bringing it back to public employees and local interest groups, because I can sometimes float away during this podcast. But bringing it back down to the subject matter of your book, though, one thing I did want to be sure to ask you about is firefighters, because I don't think people, and this is something I learned from you in your class, like the power of firefighters as an interest group in California, I think, or in the United States, I mean, I feel like it's one of the most underrated centers of political power in the United States is the firefighters. So could you tell us a little bit about why are firefighters so powerful? Why is that power so invisible so much of the time? And what are the sort of consequences of that?
Well, so like police officers, teachers, other city or local government employees, they're organized in large part. There's a deep historical story that Jessica Traunstein and I have learned a lot about in the last year, which I won't delve into at this moment. But for a lot of the same reasons as teachers and police officers and other public employees, they're well unionized, they're well organized, actually in more states than teachers. Even in places like Wyoming, you see firefighter organizations. And they have an interest in what cities do, absolutely. And it has to do with the fact that the city governments are, or in some cases, special districts, if you have fire protection districts, are the entities that employ them and that provide their salaries and their pensions and also the equipment that is used for municipal fire protection. And so you have the same general setup as you have for these other groups of employees. It's not much that's different. Now, why is it quieter, and why does it seem like, we say they're more active or more influential than, say, police officers? I think with comparing to police officers, it has to do with the nature of conflict, right? The job is different. It doesn't involve upsetting people in the same way. It's a different job, and that, I think, leads to less conflict and more popularity as well. People think very highly of firefighters. And so I think that's part of it. And the quiet nature of it probably has to do with the kinds of things they have an interest in, right? I have a case study in the book, Local Interests, about West Covina and how there was a controversy. What is that controversy over? It has to do with replacing a fire engine with a Quint, a smaller vehicle that requires fewer staff to operate. Now, that's a big deal locally because it's a budget matter, right? When a city is fiscally distressed, they're looking for ways to save, and having a piece of equipment that doesn't require as many people, it's a big deal. Now, is that going to get people excited and, make the Washington Post? Probably not. Right. It's just that. And I think that lends itself to sort of a quieter politics. On top of that, a lot of decisions along these lines are made in the bargaining process, which we don't see. We're not part of that negotiation. So I think that for all of those reasons, and there isn't typically a group that's out there in most cases talking about firefighters in the way that now many people are talking about police officers.
Although that may change because as we were scheduling this interview with you, that Los Angeles Times story came out about the firefighters who had committed some fairly horrific abuses on the job and managed to keep their jobs. And I remember seeing that article, and I'm not justifying this reaction, but my first reaction was, oh, I can't wait to talk about firefighters with Sarah Anzia.
Well, and I think that useful direction this could take us down is thinking just where we should be thinking going forward, and things I would like to do more research on are the policies that matter that don't appear to cost anything. It doesn't result in a building where people get shade on their cucumber plant or their zucchini plant. It's not that. And it's not even a budgetary matter where they get some increase in spending, or it's the provisions that get put into the contract that govern how people do their jobs, right? For example, what process, it has to do with those processes. What processes have to be followed and adhered to in the case of some alleged misconduct, right? Those things, it's not like a dollar figure that comes with it. Are they costly, or could they be? Absolutely, but not in the sense that people can feel, hold, see in the same way you can with a building or something on the budget. And I think that they seem free, but in the long run, they have impacts. And it's, we don't spend enough time thinking about those things, even though a lot of what local government does is provide public services. And these are the kinds of things that shape how those public services are provided.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that of course, you deal very squarely with in your book, but the challenge of measuring a lot of this stuff. And I think I think methodologically, a really amazing thing about the book is the figuring out, how we can make broad comparisons about interest group activity and power and outcomes. But, then there's even subtler features, right? Contract details. I mean, this is, of course, a very, very similar issue with land use policy, right? You can know all of the details of what's in the zoning code and still probably not predict land use outcomes or development outcomes or entitlement processes with any reliability.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And because the effects of these things, to the extent they have effects, happen in the longer term or in some aggregate way. I think that's right. At the same time, I don't think we should just throw our hands in the air and say, well, it's not worth studying. I think there are some, because again, as I said, people have been interested in public education for a very long time. There have been attempts to understand, for example, seniority provisions in teachers' contracts, meaning who gets first choice to move to a more a desired school. Is there some provision saying senior teachers get to pick first, or last in, first out kind of provisions? So those provisions and contracts have been tracked and coded in a few studies. And I think we're starting to see the same now happening with police, right? And one could imagine doing it for firefighters. It's challenging because if there's no contract, if you're in a place where there isn't a contract to study, how do you do that? But it's similar in nature, right? And you're still left with the problem or the challenge, the research challenge that you identify, Nolan, which is even if you code all these things, how exactly that does or does not lead to certain outcomes is difficult to say. But through statistical analysis, you can say if you have this provision, if you have a larger minimum lot size, for example, requirement, maybe you're less likely to get, or you're going to, on average, get fewer housing units built. I think that kind of thing is very much doable, even if it's not a deterministic process.
Well, thank you for anytime a guest mentions minimum lot size is unprovoked. I know the podcast has been a success. I want to ask another sort of angle on this. To what extent does scale matter? So do larger jurisdictions and smaller jurisdictions do interest politics vary in any systematic way, or is it broadly the same but just at a different scale?
Yeah, so it does vary, and in some ways it doesn't, and we need to know more. So I actually have an excellent I'm working with an excellent PhD student, Anna Weissman, who's interested in some of these questions about differences in local politics depending on size. So I delve into this a little bit in my book, but there's a lot more we still want to know. So one of the things we can say that the number of groups involved and the amount of interest group activity does increase with the size of a city. So in a smaller place, you have fewer groups, they do less. You're still left with a local chamber of commerce and things of that sort. But it's when you increase city size, you get up to 50,000 residents or above, then you start to see more groups doing more in local politics. Now, I think that one possible mistake people sometimes make is in assuming that as you get more groups, you're getting more conflict between groups. That's not necessarily the case. And I think one of the things I really try to be clear about in the book is that just because you have a lot of groups active, it doesn't mean they're fighting each other. Again, we think about national politics and we think, oh, everybody's on a side. You're on the Democratic side or the Republican side, and these groups are clashing with one another. Business and labor, they're on opposite sides, fighting one another. It's just not often the same at the local level. You can have a housing development proposed or some land use issue. The police and the firefighters are not typically paying attention to that issue. They're not fighting the developers. They're not fighting the Chamber of Commerce. When it comes to questions of police salaries and spending, real estate developers are not weighing in typically on those kinds of things. So you get it's more siloed oftentimes in local politics. So even if you have a lot of groups active, that doesn't mean, oh, they're fighting with each other and working working against one another. In housing, you get a lot of conflict, but it's not the municipal employees typically who are yet involved in that on a regular basis. So I think that's just something we have to be careful about in characterizing what happens when there are more groups.
Were there groups that got involved in particular issues at some scale that you found surprising? Like realtors or police or one of those organizations getting involved in something that you wouldn't have thought was their lane?
Okay. So it's not something, if we're talking about the book, I don't see much of that. I don't talk about much of that in there. And yet, again, one thing always leads to another in my research. There's always some unanswered thing or some puzzling thing that I think I really need to understand that. So one of the projects I'm working on now is the focus is on business. And I won't say much about it, except that part of what's driving my interest in this is that at the local level, I think businesses in chambers of commerce, they have an interest actually. It's not like at the national level where, oh, we're anti-government, anti-spending. No, they want the local government to be able to be well-funded and do certain things. And I think one of the things you see alignments on sometimes in city council meetings is you have, business and police kind of lining up on things. And so I am interested in that. It makes sense once you start to think about it, but it's not something that I really got into in the book, again, just so that it wasn't 1,000 pages, but I really think it's something that we may be common in local politics.
There was a finding that jumped out at me is that, right. So local governments that have very active police and firefighters unions, they spend more per capita on those services, to be expected. But the flip side, I was totally surprised by, if you have a more active chamber, you also lose quite a lot of money on a per capita basis of like tax abatements and like business friendly tax relief.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, so that's interesting. And I think, it'd be interesting. So one question is the magnitude of the tax abatement, right? So this is like is chipping away at the tax base, and a lot of local spending is police and fire, right? And it's a big part of the budget. But it's true that in those instances you have you can imagine local officials being conflicted, right? For example, on, well, when it comes to tax expenditures, and Nate Jensen is really the expert on tax expenditures, but you can imagine them being conflicted. They want to maintain the tax base. You also want to do something to look like you're attracting or keeping business in the city. And so how do you handle that? It's an interesting issue.
This raises something. Oh, sorry, Nolan.
Yeah, please. I was going to switch gears a little bit here. I will raise it here now.
This just raises something I think is interesting too about local politics versus federal politics. I would say even state and local politics versus federal, which is that budgeting decisions are on an annual basis genuinely zero sum. You don't have the same just fiscal capacity that you have at the federal level, where you can print more money, and so it's interesting to see how much cooperation there can be between interest groups at the local level, given the relative scarcity of resources. You would expect more of a crabs in a bucket type dynamic, and I'm curious whether that's something that does manifest itself in some ways. I mean, why isn't the chamber going to war with the cops to get more tax abatements versus a larger police budget?
Well, and this is the reason that I'm interested in looking at this, because they like the police. I think would say in general, again, I usually cringe a little bit when people talk about business as a unit. It's not. It's there's heterogeneity there, but I think that this is one of the things I want to learn more about. That in general, business like having a strong, well-resourced police force for a lot of reasons, and so it's not as though they would see that as a potential conflict. And the other thing is that I like your point about how there's this budget constraint, and so if you have to make cuts, it's coming out of someone else's pot. At the same time, just like at the state level or at the federal level, there's always an attempt to use sort of one-time funds or short-term things to try to get through the budget challenges, like the COVID relief spending. That helped a lot of local governments avoid their structural problems for a few years. But also in California, and every state has different ways of increasing revenue. But another thing I'm more and more interested in is the politics of new revenue generation, because one of the things that California local governments have done, or many of them, is tried to pass additional tax increases. So increase the sales and use tax, increase the business taxes, and the transient occupancy tax. And you have to, in California, that has to come with a ballot measure, which is kind of nice, because then you can look at those ballot measures, which I've been working on. But yeah, so you can try to increase the revenue. And I think the challenge often is for cities is that they're limited in what they can do there, right? They can increase sales and use tax up to a point, and then there's a cap. And so you have to get people to vote for it. And they actually don't have many levers they can pull. School districts, it's a little bit different, right? Their funding structure is different. So I think that the ability to raise more revenue is something that a lot of local governments are thinking about, that would ease that budget constraint, so that it's not just doesn't end up sort of a tug of war, a war over spending or spending cuts. And the last thing I'll say is that a lot of times cuts happen gradually and in ways that are not as likely to get people angry. So what we've seen in California and in other places as well is a slow erosion of the number of employees. One of local government's biggest expense items are that the employees, and it happens more often through freezing positions or eliminating vacant positions than firing somebody, right? So I think that it's a quieter, less controversial way of making some of those cuts that might avoid some of the conflicts that you were describing. That
big picture question for you here. At California YIMBY, we're in the business of changing laws at the state level, but a lot of YIMBY chapters are really focused on local policy change. Let's say somebody's listening in, they run a local YIMBY chapter. What would they do differently if they fully understood Sarah Anzia thought? How would they approach their advocacy work differently?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that the importance of having a presence all the time, right? It's most local policymaking, or a lot of local policymaking, is not, oh, there's one big vote or one big bill, and we really need to mobilize on this thing. I think more often it's this it's seemingly small things that are happening all the time. And one of the things that strikes me as quite important, to the extent one can, would be to make sure there is always a presence, no matter how seemingly small something seems, because those things that seem little are not, right? They add up to a lot. And so I think becoming one of the regular players, this is something I talk a lot about in the book, is that there are groups that come and go. There's some group that weighs in on some decision and then they disband. And I'm not saying they don't matter, but what's important to know about local politics is that there are regular players that have an ongoing direct interest in decisions that are being made. And so I think if somebody or some group wants to play a role in that, they have to mimic that. They have to be there for that. And that's hard to do. I think that is really, really hard to do because of the collective action problem, because people are busy. And when the challenge, I think the biggest challenge is recognizing that just the depth of the interests that many of these regular players have. And so finding a way to try to create that among your people, that's the way to really have influence and be able to counter that.
That's a really good answer. Be present, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, showing up at some of these things is everything.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Yeah, sure. So lightning round, as short as you can make them. Favorite restaurant in Berkeley?
Ooh, it closed during COVID. What's that vegan sushi place on Shattuck? It was just there last night. Sorry, I'm not remembering the name.
But it's still open.
It's still open. Actually, it
Okay.
opened. There was a San Francisco one. Okay, I'm going to get it all wrong, but it's wonderful.
Okay. Other than, of course, local interest, if you could put a political science book on the desk of every policymaker in Sacramento, which one would you pick?
A political science book on of every policymaker in Sacramento. I would say Einstein, Glick, and Palmer, Neighborhood Defenders.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Fantastic book. And completely changes how you see local public process.
Mm-hmm.
We love that book over here. I feel like we cite it all the time.
It's a great book.
Yeah.
I'll ask another one, and Ned, you're up next. A movie that you think understands interest group dynamics.
Does it have to be a movie?
Could be a TV show, as long as it's prestige TV.
The Wire.
Tell me more about that.
Wow, there's a lot to say there. Okay. I love the scene where Carcetti is campaigning, and it's during that season. And he's talking about, they're telling him that I think it's the police are endorsing the incumbent. And he says, well, are they endorsing him, or are they like phone banking for him? How hard are they working for him? Is this just and I love that moment.
Mine, I know this is you're the guest, but I got to plug Show Me a Hero on housing politics.
Okay.
I mean, just the impossible situation that we put local electeds in so often,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Great. Well, what's next for you? You've teased a few things that you're working on. What's the next big project here?
A couple of things. So I am looking at California ballot measures seeking to increase taxes and trying to understand where business falls on those. And so I have some thoughts on that, and I'll be working on that more this summer. In addition, I'm continuing to work on some data collection related to retiree costs, OPEB and public pensions. I have some additional ideas on that. And I have this ongoing project with Jessica Traunstein on the development of cities and civil service, in particular police and firefighters, and it's firefighters in particular. It's really fascinating. And I think it just has big implications for city governance. And so I'm excited to see where that goes.
Great. Well, Sarah, this was a ton of fun. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been really, really great to talk to both of you.